Hello, beautiful friends. Welcome to my channel. I'm really glad you're here. Today's video will take a closer look at how the language we use can trap us into frames of understanding which are limited, sometimes painfully so. How thoughts and ideas are often shaped by absence, by exclusion, and that by reminding ourselves of this, we can begin to name and notice false dichotomies to remind us of the powerful influence of our words, narratives, and frames of perception. At the end of this video, I'll leave you with a meditative phrase that you can connect to your breath to help internalize anything you might learn or find helpful from today's deeper dive. So, in my last video, I examined the false dichotomy of cisgender and transgender. How the term cisgender as an opposite for transgender actually perpetuates an unnecessary binary, which further erases intersex people and increases the perceived distance between trans and non-trans people. As we've been examining in many of our previous videos, one of the limitations of language is the narrowness with which it can shape our frames of understanding. And it is not that the frames of understanding given to us by language are altogether unhelpful. Obviously, we have to draw conclusions and trust our observation of the world in some manner if we hope to continue forging our lives. But we can easily become too attached to these frames of understanding, quickly and easily forgetting that there are other ways of looking at and thinking about things. And thus, we become held hostage by the very patterns of thinking we help create. But as is the case with the word cisgender, where an unfortunately exclusive word was created in an attempt to meet a legitimate need, we can see that other words and ideas are often negatively construed. That is, once we name something, anything, good, beautiful, transgender, we begin to more clearly think of that thing in terms of its single stories of distance or difference. By naming one thing as good, we come to see other things as not good, not beautiful, not trans. And then we create other words, bad, ugly, or cisgender. When we understand this, that most pairs of opposites, and indeed much of language, is formed by distinguishing things from one another, by separating things from the world that surrounds them, by parsing things apart and holding distance, it makes a great deal more sense why so much of society and thought are dominated by somewhat rigid stories of difference, hierarchy, and normativity. We have come to believe in the ideas of good and bad as fixed concepts which apply not only to us as individuals, but as a rule which should apply to all people, as if we all share the same needs, desires, and frames of understanding. In other words, while language is a powerful tool which we can use to help give shape to our reality and better articulate those things which we perceive, it also has a tendency to keep us trapped in limited frames of understanding, and to collapse the actual diversity that we see and experience into a few narratives or scripts which inevitably flatten and foreclose certain perspectives. Thus, on an experiential level, so much of what we are taught to perceive is defined by its opposite. Take color, for instance. When we look at something and conclude its color, our perception is true to us. The leaf appears green. But in fact, when sunlight hits a leaf, the leaf absorbs all colors except for green. And our perception is the remaining light which is reflected back into our eyes. The color that the leaf absorbs actually looks like this. So our perception that the leaf is green, which is assuredly true for which crayon we should pick up or how we might describe the color of the leaf to one another, but the substantive color of the chlorophyll, the light that the leaf absorbs, is actually the complementary color, or the opposite of green, a kind of reddish-orange color. And what we are seeing is all the light the leaf does not absorb, the light it reflects. And thus, the way we define or speak about color is actually by its absence, by what a surface rejects rather than what is absorbed. Our perception of color is true at an individual or social level, but it is insufficient at capturing the complexities of light and absorption. But just because something is scientifically true doesn't necessarily mean that it represents our social or personal lives. So let's consider another example, that of a coin. Let's take, for example, a quarter. This copper-nickel alloy is loaded with nationalist imagery which designates its status as currency, providing it with a value of 25 cents. But this value changes, and what was once the value of a quarter in 1920 is now about $3.23 today, just 100 years later. So we can see that the meaning and value of this quarter is not fixed. But what's more, to someone who isn't familiar with United States currency, or say a child, a baby, or a dog, then a coin is nothing more than the material that makes it up. A quarter is in fact just a blend of 91.67% copper and 8.33% nickel, all the way through. But to those of us who use quarters on a regular basis, we recognize the face of George Washington as the quarter's head, and the bald eagle on the background as tails. But the difference between heads and tails on a quarter doesn't actually hold any recognizable difference outside of the meaning we have assigned them. It's not that a child couldn't tell that one side has a picture of a bird and the other a picture of a face, but that they are unlikely to think of this unified coin primarily in terms of difference. The easier, perhaps more honest observation is that the heads and tails side of a quarter are really just demarcated parts of a unified whole. And we must be taught to assign meaning that is different, to discriminate, to think in terms of difference. But those of us who are intimately familiar with quarters, who are so accustomed to seeing and thinking in terms of heads and tails, often struggle to remember or realize that these distinctions are constructed, quite arbitrarily, and that to us, while a quarter undeniably has a heads and tails, there are other frames that we can use to look at the same coin. And this is true of many of the binaries we perpetuate in our thoughts and actions. What appear to be unreconcilable differences between identities, people, values, can often be differently, perhaps more honestly thought of as two sides of the same coin. But this analogy serves as a further reminder that just because the faces of a coin are socially constructed, that is, just because a quarter is actually just a copper-nickel alloy that we could fashion in any manner, does not make its construction inconsequential. And it doesn't mean that you couldn't lose a bet because of a coin toss. Many of our other binaries function in a similar manner. We are capable of thinking outside of a male, female, good, bad, beautiful, ugly dichotomy, of recognizing all of these as two sides of the same coin. But socially, as a collective, we do not. And thus, children are sorted by their theoretically coherent sex. Certain people or behaviors are excluded from full participation in society and labeled as bad. And many of us feel deeply insecure about how we look because we are made to feel less beautiful, simply because we fail to measure up to the unrealistic, photoshopped standards of beauty which are manufactured to sell products. We are capable of reminding ourselves that these binaries are not fixed, but it is extremely difficult when we are surrounded by people who continue to see and insist on interpreting the coin for its faces instead of for its substance, for its similarity. But the example of the coin is still perhaps a degree or two removed from more complex social norms. So let's look more closely at one of these other binaries, and let's go with the false dichotomy of beautiful and ugly, which I know has seriously affected me, and I suspect it has many of you as well. So when people saw something that brought them pleasure, aesthetic attraction, we named that sensation and called it beautiful, hailed it as good, wanted to see more of it. And by selecting certain aesthetics as good, as beautiful, we then began to more quickly and thoroughly delineate other things as non-beautiful, as ugly. Once we had these names, this binary, it became easier and easier to sort everything into one of these two categories. And things which may have fallen somewhere in the middle, as indeed everything does, began to be forced into one of two boxes. Because beautiful was and is defined as much by what is absent than what is present, then anything that wasn't supposed to be there, anything that failed to meet the standards of beauty, was deemed ugly, deemed lesser. It is not as if any beautiful thing necessarily exists. Sure, there are things which strike awe and move us more easily, but by pursuing those things, by seeking them out and marking them off, we continue to imply that things which we don't find beautiful are not worthy of the same attention or affection. And those attributes of value and inspiration which so-called ugly things possess are paid less attention to, because we don't perceive them as worth our time or adoration. It is important to realize as well that the things that are deemed beautiful are always changing. Art which is hailed as genius by one generation can be laughed at, disregarded, or written off as passé by the next. Take a look at fashion styles, even 10 or 20 years ago, and many of the things which sparked desire, envy, or attraction are now sitting in landfills or thrift stores, simply because they are no longer in, no longer considered beautiful. What's more, the standards of beauty are always dictated by those with the loudest voices, with the most social influence, so they often reflect the sensibilities of rich people, of white people, of non-trans men. And this measure of beauty, at least with regards to human bodies and human expression, is heavily influenced by a drive to sell clothes and makeup and accessories, which can only remain marketable if they continue to be consumed. If people are made to feel continually inadequate and unsatisfied, and are led to believe that they will become beautiful only by constant consumption. And this has spiraled out of control. Just a cursory glance at body standards today, compared to even those of 50 years ago, should be enough to explain why eating disorders, negative self-talk, and dissatisfaction with one's body continue to increase at epidemic proportions. And the so-called fixes for this, which are often peddled, ideas of loving yourself or treating yourself, are almost always similarly commodified. They assure us that we will feel better if we keep spending, because you're worth it, because you deserve it. But what we are all worth and what we actually deserve is incomprehensibly more than what we are actually given or how we are made to feel. When we take a moment to remind ourselves that beautiful and ugly are a false dichotomy, are two sides of the same coin that is the awe-inspiring and limitless possibility of expansive human expression, we can easily see that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, that the messages that we have been fed are toxic and dishonest, hurting both us and the still unfathomable beauty of the planet we live on. And that we have been encouraged or forced to give up this perspective for the endless pursuit of what we are told is beautiful, and which indeed continues to appear beautiful for as long as we all continue to chase after whatever new horizon of beauty can sell a new product. But hear me, I am not proposing some easy fix. My words come with no price tag, but I'm not suggesting that feeling beautiful is as simple as recognizing why we are in the mess we are in. It just begins there. In the same way that I cannot unsee heads or tails on a quarter, understanding the relativity of false dichotomies is not the same as undoing their strongholds in our hearts and minds. Those things take practice, work, and dedication to continually see through the facade, to consciously choose to see a unified coin where so many other voices insist on separating heads and tails. And the process of reclaiming your own perception of your body and a healthy balance in your mind is as much a matter of unlearning those normative standards and false binaries that we have become quite resigned to, as it is about pursuing those things which bring you new hope or fresh perspective. But to wrap things up with a bit of a brighter side, it is important to remember that we don't need to think in false dichotomies or extremes about our own healing either. There is nothing wrong with the feeling of awe, attraction, or inspiration that triggers what we might call beautiful. It is only when we insist on making these observations rigid that we risk false dichotomies. So there's nothing wrong with enjoying and embracing life, but when we create a norm, a standard, or a rule, when we begin to define things primarily in terms of their exclusion and their difference, then we actually begin to foreclose the possibility of seeing the beauty in everything, because we become too attached to a single perspective. We fail to remind ourselves that there is something beautiful and something not so beautiful in everything we see. But when we remind ourselves that beauty is a matter of perspective, that even the most ugly things we perceive still have some element of awe-inspiring value, we can remind ourselves that our frames of understanding are always incomplete, which frees us to look more closely, carefully, and creatively in an attempt to admire and increase the beauty that we see all around, and to learn from the perception of others, to embrace the relativity of beauty by learning to appreciate things through one another's perception, to become more humble and open to new ways of seeing, and to become more collectively attuned to possibilities of beauty which do not depend on consumption or exclusivity, but are built on mutual joy, creative potential, and a deep and sustainable appreciation for the reality we experience and construct together. So, as promised, I'll leave you with a meditative phrase that you can connect to your breath to help remind you of the limitations of false dichotomies, and that there are always other perspectives you can explore when your current frame of understanding feels like all you can see. For this, we'll use the imagery of our coin to help visualize a more abstract idea. And it goes like this. So on the inhale, think to yourself, heads or tails. And here we're thinking of any false dichotomy, any frame of thinking that feels too uncomfy, too limiting. And on the exhale, it's all the same coin. Heads or tails. It's all the same coin. Heads or tails, it's all the same coin. If you enjoyed today's video or it meant something to you, please give it a thumbs up and click subscribe. Your support means a great deal to me as I want to provide reflections which speak to you. And if you're feeling brave and vulnerable enough to share something you enjoyed or felt challenged by from today's video, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Otherwise, thank you for watching. I wish you peace and perspective. I love you all as I love myself, as we are part of the same world, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. If you missed my earlier video on the false dichotomy of cisgender and transgender, you can find that here. If you would like to know more about me or this channel, you can find that video right here. And if you would like to check out my first series of videos on naming and framing, you can catch that playlist right here.